Okay, well, everyone, thank you for coming. Today's presentation with a shortened title now is Motivational Crowding in PES, Instrumental versus Relational Values of Nature. For the first part of this, I'm going to be explaining some concepts, the conceptual framework, so you can more easily understand why it is that we carried out this study. So for those of you that don't know, payments for ecosystem services are a type of policy, of environmental policy, which, unlike other types of programs, they offer positive incentives to landowners rather than negative ones. So a lot of environmental policy has traditionally relied on fines or taxes. PES rely instead on positive incentives that try to internalize the cost of negative behaviors. So for instance, a very stereotypical PES case would be you have some farmers upstream, as you can see in the little diagram, with a city downstream. And the decisions that the farmers make upstream can have an impact on the well-being of people downstream. For instance, if they use a lot of fertilizer, or if their cows are allowed to approach the river can get dirty. And so sometimes it might be cheaper for the city to pay farmers, so make a fund, for instance, by increasing the amount that they charge for water, make a fund and pay the farmers to build fences or to reduce the amount of cattle they have or to plant a tree buffer than it is to build a water treatment plant. And so PES traditionally have been conceptualized in this way. You have ecosystem service providers upstream, ecosystem service users downstream, and they can come to an agreement whereby using positive incentives, everyone can win. Now, these types of programs have been implemented more and more ever since the 1990s because they're quite politically easy to implement. They're voluntary, so it's hard to get people to oppose them because you don't have to participate if you don't want. And they offer positive incentives rather than fines. So, it seems, at least at first glance, like it's a win-win. However, there's been fears in the academic literature that these types of programs may generate motivational crowding out. And what does that mean? Motivational crowding out is when intrinsic motivations are replaced by extrinsic motivations. So intrinsic motivations include all these activities that you performed for their own sake, either because you enjoy them or because they feel good. These could include, for instance, visiting a family member. You don't expect to win anything by going to visit your family. You think it's the right thing. You enjoy seeing them. And these types of intrinsic motivations drive a lot of our behavior. For instance, I might go jogging out in the morning because it's a pleasant activity for me to do. However, extrinsic motivations also drive a lot of our behaviors. And these types of motivations are seen as you perform an activity as a means to an end, whether this is to avoid a punishment or receive a reward. For instance, if I'm driving down the highway and I want to go at 140 kilometers an hour, but I don't, the reason that I stay underneath the speed limit is because I'm afraid of a fine. And so in this case, the motivation for me to drive slower doesn't come from within me, it comes from outside. Someone is gonna charge me money if they catch me going too fast. And so these are extrinsic motivations. And so the fear with PES sometimes is that by including an extrinsic payment, you might get rid of people's intrinsic motivations to protect nature. So what are some real world examples of motivational crowding out? The first example I found in the literature is from the 1970s. And this was a study where they offered money to people to donate blood and then compared the number of people that were willing to donate blood with those that hadn't been offered any money. So as an economist, one would expect that by offering people money, you'd get an increase in the number of people that were willing to donate blood. However, in this study, you saw the opposite. When people were asked to donate blood for free, there was a higher rate of people that were willing to donate blood than when you paid them money to do so. And why is this? Well, this is because most people, when they want to donate blood, they do it because they think it's the right thing to do, because it feels good, because you think you might be saving a life. And then when you introduce money into the equation, all of a sudden it cheapens that feeling. It seems like, am I donating blood now for the €5 I'm receiving, or am I doing it because I'm a good person? And so suddenly introducing an extrinsic motivation into this scenario that before was only driven by people's goodwill has this perverse impact where the rate can go down. Another very famous example in the literature that a lot of motivational crowding out studies mention is this one from the year 2000, where a kindergarten. So parents would take their kids and drop them off in this daycare. And at the end of the day, there was always a couple parents that would always arrive late. They were supposed to arrive at 4 and they always arrived at 4:15 or 4:20. And so the kindergarten eventually implemented a series of fines. If you arrived late, you had to pay, imagine, 10 euros. And what ended up happening is that the number of parents that would arrive late to pick up their kids increased rather than decreased. The explanation for that is that initially parents were trying to arrive on time because they felt a social contract with the teachers. They didn't want to make the teachers wait past their closing time. But as soon as you put money into this equation, parents started to change the way they thought about it. They started thinking, is it worth it for me to pay 10 euros and arrive late? Or should I try to arrive now? So if you had an important meeting or if you were working on something very important, all of a sudden it stopped being about the social contract with the teachers and it started being about whether it was worth it or not to pay 10 euros to arrive late. The scenario was even worse because once the kindergarten found out that the fines had actually made more parents arrive late, they removed the fines, but the number of parents that arrived late stayed the same. So the number of parents that started arriving late after the fine had been removed was higher than before the fine had ever been implemented. One final example from my own work is in the indigenous community that I went to do my PhD work. They had this traditional practice that had been going on for centuries, which they call mingas, and it's voluntary work. So on Sundays, normally, one person per household was expected to contribute their work, whether to plant a field with all the neighbors or build a house. And one of the things that this community work was used for was to maintain roads in the community. All the roads were dirt roads, and so because it rained a lot in the area, it was quite common to get these like big holes on the roads. And so, once a month, people would come out and help fix the roads up. And then one day, the UN, through the World Food Program, arrived in the area, and they implemented this program where they wanted to give people rice because the area had a high index of malnutrition. And so they figured, look, there's this wonderful practice where people are coming and volunteering their work. It seems like it makes sense to try and tie this like food that we're giving the community with the volunteer work. So this way we can recognize their work. And so what happened immediately is they started getting twice as many volunteers as they ever had, because now volunteering wasn't only out of a sense of duty or a sense of community, but you were getting a bag of rice, which was great. And then when the program ended a couple of years later, the rate of volunteering plummeted way below what it was initially. And so all of a sudden, there was this accidental impact of introducing rice into the equation, because initially people had volunteered because they thought it was the right thing to do. Like if no one does this, then these roads are going to go into disrepair. And the act of introducing an extrinsic motivator got rid of this intrinsic motivation to do it. And so that's motivational crowding out. Why is PES, Payments for Ecosystem Services, why have they been associated with motivational crowding out? Or why is there a fear that they might cause motivational crowding out? Well, this is because PES are conceptualized using a utilitarian human nature relational model. What this means is that cognitively, they frame nature as a provider of services, and it puts the people working next to nature as people offering these services and people paying the money as service providers. And so all of a sudden, nature is framed in terms of euros or dollars or pesos. And so seeing nature in this very instrumental way may change the reason that some people want to conserve. It's possible that if certain people, groups of people were conserving nature before because they thought it was the right thing to do, all of a sudden putting money into the equation might have these perverse outcomes, which we call motivational crowding out. And so PES, particularly when it's framed in a very transactional way, has been found to have a higher risk of motivational crowding out. However, there's also been instances where PES have been associated with motivational crowding in, which is the opposite effect. And this is when intrinsic motivations are reinforced by extrinsic motivations. So for instance, if people perceive the payment to be a fair and a just social recognition for work that they've been doing, they might feel a lot better about conserving. So imagine you're a poor farmer and you've been conserving half of your land as a forest, and you continuously think, well, if I cut it down, I could probably plant more corn or potatoes here and I could make more money. But no, I'm not going to do it because if we all do it, we're going to run out of forest. Well, all of a sudden, introducing money into the equation can be framed in a way that it's seen by the people as recognition for past efforts. And so what that does is bolster your pro-environmental motivation. You're like, yes, like finally, look, all this hard work we've been doing is finally being recognized. Similarly, it might send out the social message that protecting nature is important. So in a lot of rural areas, environmental education is quite low or non-existent. And so having programs that come in that are associated with education, showing people the value of nature, both for their communities and people downstream, adding funds so people can feel supported, all of a sudden it might send this message that like, hey, if the government's willing to spend money on this, it might be because this is really important. And so slowly it might change people's cognitive relationships with nature. Similarly, if you're the only person in your village that's interested in protecting the forest and everyone else is cutting it down to increase the amount of hectares they have with a farm, for instance, PES can be the thing that all of a sudden starts pushing people to your side, right? So all of a sudden, it's a lot easier to conserve if you see everyone else around you conserving. And so you might enter a new state of equilibrium where all of a sudden the new norm is that no, we need to conserve, and it's even better if people support us from the government. Therefore, in this study, what I want to see is if framing PES in different ways is more likely to cause motivational crowding in or motivational crowding out. Specifically, the two treatments that I test are going to be in one, I'm going to frame nature in very instrumental terms, which is normally done with PES. And then in another treatment, I'm going to frame it in a lot more relational terms. And so this brings up these different mental models or relational models. The first one of utilization, that your relationship with nature is one of like, I want to conserve nature because I need services from nature. And the second framing is going to be much more about stewardship or devotion, seeing nature as a spiritual place, seeing nature as a place where we have experiences with our families, with our loved ones. And so seeing the objective is to go to 3 different communities that are culturally distinct and seeing if these 2 different framings have similar or different effects on the effectiveness of PES. So I'm going to now explain what I mean by values and what I mean by relational modeling. The value framework that I use has 3 different types of values of nature: instrumental value, relational value, and intrinsic value. And everyone can value nature in these 3 different ways. So they're not exclusive, they're complementary. The instrumental value is when we see nature as a means to an end. So because it provides us with clean water, with wood, with fresh air, with pollination. And this type of value is very anthropocentric. We consider nature valuable because it does something for humans. However, we consider nature substitutable. So I don't care if my bottle of water comes from a river over there, or if the Coca-Cola company brings it in a truck. I don't care if my wood comes from that tree or from a different country, as long as I can have that wood to build my house or to burn in my fireplace. So instrumental value in this sense is considered substitutable. It doesn't matter whether it comes from nature, not from nature. I just need it as a means to an end, to heat my house, to build my house, to pollinate my crops. Relational value, which is also anthropocentric, we still consider nature valuable because it increases human well-being, is concerned with meaningful relationships. So it's this idea of like appreciating the landscape beauty, getting a sense of place, shared experiences. So going out on the weekend with your kids and teaching them the names of the trees. Some people associate nature with a spiritual value as well. In this sense, relational value we consider anthropocentric, but not substitutable. And that's because you develop specific relationships with specific aspects of nature or places. An easy example to see what I mean by relational value is imagine that the government comes and takes your kid and they bring in a new kid and they say, hey, don't worry, it's a kid for a kid. And this one's actually going to help you out a lot more in the house. It's going to clean the dishes, it's going to make its room, and it's going to play nice with his sister. Well, the instrumental value of that kid might go up because it's a lot more helpful around the house. But I think very few parents would be willing to trade their kid off because they have a relationship with their kid specifically. You can't just substitute one kid by another because the relationship you have is with your kid. And so in this sense, the value is anthropocentric, but not substitutable. And then finally, although I'm not going to be talking about it very much in the presentation, there's the intrinsic value of nature. And this is when we consider nature valuable for its own sake. So whether there was humans or not in the picture, we think that nature has a right to exist or might actually have rights to be protected from people. And so this type of value is biocentric rather than anthropocentric. I don't care if I'm going to see a polar bear or not in all my life. I think that the polar bears have a right to exist in a habitat that lets them live full polar bear lives. And so these three different types of values are different ways to value nature, but they complement each other because conceptually they can be quite different. And what do I mean by human nature relational models? Well, these are the different mental frames or the cognitive frames that give shape to the relationship that we have with nature. In this case, I use 7 archetypes, which you can see on the left, and I won't go through each of them individually, but I'll show you some examples. So for instance, some people, and in different contexts, you might have a specific relational model, and in a different context, you might have another. So again, they don't counter each other, but they can be activated in certain contexts. So detachment, for instance, is when nature is perceived as not important. If you live in a city, you might like to have concrete underneath your feet, and the bugs gross you out. You don't want to be walking, getting sweaty in nature. So you're detached from nature. Nature is invisible for you. Your food comes from the supermarket and not from animals. And so this is a type of relationship that some people might have with nature. Others, for instance, might have a feeling of devotion towards nature, seeing it as religious or as spiritual. Other people might have a feeling of utilization. I want to protect nature because I need it for goods and services, and I recognize that without nature, we would all die. And that's the type of relationship I have with nature. It's one where I recognize its value for what it can do to me. So in the 2 treatments that I'm going to test, in the first case, I'm going to frame the value of nature as being very instrumental, and the relational model as one of utilization. And in the second framing, we're going to highlight relational values, which are a lot more associated with stewardship and devotion. Where did we carry out this experiment? So we went to 3 different communities in Colombia. One of them was an Afro-Colombian community, another one was an indigenous community, and another one was a campesino community. So in this case, the campesinos are people that they're like peasants. They work, they live in the countryside, but they don't associate ethnically with any of the other groups. These 3 communities were quite close to each other. So in the map on the left, which is in the Valle del Cauca in Western Colombia, you can see that the first 2 communities are where the number 1 is, and they were on either side of a river. So the Afro-Colombian community was on one side of the river, and the indigenous community was on the other, and there's a bridge connecting them. And then the campesino community was about 20 kilometers away on a map, although in practice, because this is in the Andes Mountains and the terrain's quite hard to get to, it takes about 2 hours. So it's only 20 kilometers away, but it takes 2 hours to get there from 1 to 2. So I have some pictures so you can see more or less what it looked like when we carried out the experiment. This was in the Afro-Colombian community. This was in the indigenous community. That picture in the center is the bridge that connects the 2 communities. And this was the campesino community. So in total, we had 157 people participate. And because we carried out 2 treatments in each of the 3 communities, we have a 2x3 experiment, which means we have 6 different treatments. And our goal was to get 30 people to come to each treatment. As you can see, for the most part, we managed it. We got between 26 and 30 people, except for one group where we only had 16 people, unfortunately. And that's because there was a massive storm that day, and this community is quite remote. It was for the campesino community. And so people would normally take about an hour and a half to get to the school where we carried out the experiment. And so with the storm, unfortunately, 14 people didn't show up. We used 2 main methods in this experiment. I'll describe the lab in the field experiment more in a second, which was the bulk of this study. But first, we wanted to measure these relational models. How did people think about cognitively about their relationship with nature? And so we came up with the 7 statements that you can see on the right. They never saw the labels, so detachment, domination, devotion. They would only see a little card that had the statement that you can see on the right. And we asked them to place it on the pyramid that you can see on the left. So we asked, how much do you agree with each of these 7 statements? And the reason we have this pyramid shape is because we wanted to limit the amount that they could put on the extremes to really force them to play around with the cards and order them in the order that they felt the strongest about them. During the pilot, we saw that some people were just basically doing a thumbs up and thumbs down. So they were saying like either I agree with this relational model or I don't, and they were just populating the extremes, where what we were really interested in is seeing more of an ordering. And so by limiting the two columns on the right, it forced people to think a lot more carefully about the order in which they wanted to prioritize each of these relational models. The results, which I won't go into detail, but you can see that they look relatively similar between the three different communities. So each of these groups of bars are for a single relational statement. So for instance, the first one, it says, tengo preocupaciones más urgentes que proteger la naturaleza. I have better things to worry about than protecting nature. And we can see that both this statement and the next one, there's a lot of disagreement with them. There's a lot of, the red bars are quite high. Whereas for the other 5 relational model statements, there was more of an agreement. And the differences between the communities aren't very high, as you can see. So the general shapes of the curves tend to be very similar from community to community. So I was thinking about what the best way to highlight these differences were. And if any of you have any suggestions later on, I'd love to hear it, because currently what I used was a multinomial logit model. And so what a multinomial logit model allows me to do is see, for a 1-point increase in agreement, what community are they more likely to belong to? So if I didn't know, I get all my sample and I put it together, and I have a person say that they really agree with, for example, the detachment statement, I have more pressing concerns than protecting nature, odds are that they're from the campesino community, because this community, if we go back, you can see that the campesino community for that statement actually has a bunch of people that answered a 4. Whereas for these other 2 communities, you can see that a lot more people were saying that they disagreed with that statement. However, multinomial logit models aren't the easiest to interpret, especially I think for the reader, or like you have to become familiar with the data. So if any of you know of a test that I can run to check statistically whether different communities prefer one relational model over another, I'd be glad to hear it later on. Okay, so this is the bulk of the experiment. So we used a lab in the field experiment. And this is because the theory of motivational crowding is concerned with how people are going to behave, not during an intervention, but when the intervention has ended. So if I go to a population, to a community, and I implement a payment for ecosystem services program, what happens 5 years down the line when the program has ended? This means that behavior is really hard to predict ex ante. It's hard to know if you're going to get motivational crowding in, motivational crowding out, if you're not going to get any motivational crowding at all. And so a lab in the field experiment, which is when you basically set up this artificial hypothetical situation, normally they're little games, and it gives you a glimpse into how people might behave in different treatments. So it allows you to make little tweaks to the way you frame the PES in the experiment, and it allows you to see if people behave one way or another. The reason we did this in the field, so most lab experiments are done in universities, and this is because A, it's a lot cheaper to do in a university than having to go out into the countryside. B, you have a lot more control over all the variables. So like the massive storm that I had where it made people not show up, so we had 14 people drop out, that probably wouldn't have happened in a university setting. And also, university students tend to be quite homogeneous. So in a sense, they behave almost like white lab rats, in the sense that most university students tend to be young, well-educated, they're generally not very poor. And you can compare university students in Spain with those in France, with those in the UK. They tend to be quite a homogeneous population. However, the downside about using university students is a lot of the times your results aren't externally valid. This means that you can't expect a rich university student to behave like a poor rural farmer. And so going into the field and actually running the experiment with the people whose behavior you're interested in gives you a lot more external validity in exchange for less control over certain variables. For instance, in each of my 3 populations, I had to carry out the experiment in a slightly different setting. One of the populations, we did it in a schoolroom. In another population, we did it in a community hall. And so the trade-off is that you want either more control over your variables or you prefer more external validity. The second thing we did to increase the external validity is we used real money in the experiment. So we wanted people's decisions to count, and depending on the decisions that they made in the experiment, which I'll describe in a second, we paid them or we donated the money to an environmental cause. Okay. So the experiment had this format. We gave each person the 6 cards that you can see in the top right of the screen. And so these cards had, on one side of them, it had a forest, and on the other side, it had a farm. And the farm side had a monetary amount on it. So imagine it would say one tile would say €1, another tile would say €2, another tile would say 2.5. And their decision, the scenario that they were that they confronted was, imagine these 6 hectares are yours and they're all forest, and you can decide whether you want to cut down the forest and plant, in which case you're going to keep the money that's on the card. Or assume like you plant potatoes or corn and you're going to sell that in the market and keep the money yourself. Or we're going to leave the forest standing, in which case the monetary amount that you would have taken had you farmed, we're going to donate to an environmental NGO that protects the forest in this area. And so the decision that people had was relatively close with the types of decisions that they have in the real world, where they either cut down the forest for their own private benefit, or they leave the forest standing for a public benefit, because we all benefit from having forest standing. We did this for 5 rounds. So I'd give them 6 cards. They decided if they wanted to conserve 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hectares. They could farm it all if they wanted to. And then I'd take all the cards and I'd give them new cards out again. And so the money that each card was worth was slightly different in each round. The idea was that it also reflected the real world, in the sense that some of your hectares might be more productive because they're closer to a river, or they have more sunlight, or some might be less productive because they're in a very steep hill and it's very hard to farm. So we wanted to see if people, if it was more likely they would farm their high value hectares and conserve their low value hectares. We wanted to see if people would donate at all or not. And we did this for 5 rounds. So this represents the situation before PES is implemented. This is their normal day-to-day type of decision they make when they farm. Then we had the treatment. And so for one of the 2 groups, because we did the groups separately, the lead moderator would speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, highlighting how important nature was. So she would say, okay, well, now we've been making decisions about whether to conserve or not conserve. Let's consider how valuable nature is now. And in the first treatment, she would only mention instrumental values. You say, well, we need these forests standing because we need clean water, we need wood, we need medicinal plants. And so this all highlighted, or the speech was associated with utilizing nature, with seeing nature as important to be conserved because we need it for our well-being directly. And after 5 or 10 minutes with her presentation, we split everyone into small groups and we told them, okay, now imagine that all of the forests disappeared tomorrow because they were all cut down, for instance. What types of things that you currently obtain from the forest would you have to go buy at the market instead? To try and get people into this mentality of like, well, if I don't have forest here, I'm still going to need wood. But the difference is, instead of being able to cut trees right outside my house, I'm going to have to go to the nearest city and buy wood at the market. And we let them discuss for 10 to 15 minutes about all of the uses that they obtain from the forest, right? Their medicinal plants, their clean water, tourism. The second treatment was relational. So instead of mentioning, the speech had the same structure that the moderator gave, but this time it was talking about how beautiful the landscape was, the sense of identity, how closely it was tied with their culture, to think about all the experiences they'd had with their family, with their kids, going out into the woods. And so this highlighted the relational models of stewardship and devotion. And when we split people up into small groups, the question that we told them to discuss with each other was, what is your favorite memory, your fondest memory associated with nature? And so we let them discuss nature in these beautiful terms for 10 to 15 minutes. And then we told everyone to go back and sit down individually because we were going to continue with the game. We gave out the 6 cards again, and this time we said, hey, we're going to change the rules a little bit. This time, there's an organization that, in recognition of how valuable nature is, that we've been talking for the last 30 minutes, they want to donate money to everyone who conserves hectares of forest. So if you decide to farm 1 of hectare, nothing changes. You're still going to receive the amount of money that the card says. However, if you donate the card, if you leave it standing as a forest, we're going to donate that money to an environmental NGO, but we're also going to pay you the average value of a farm tile. So there was this double dividend. If you conserve, we both donate the money, and then you actually get to keep money from a separate pool. So we did this for 5 more rounds because we wanted to see how if people increase their conservation levels, if it stayed the same. And then after 5 rounds, we said, sorry, the program's over. We go back to the original rules. You can farm your tile of land and still earn some money, or you can leave it as forest, and then we're going to donate the money instead of to you, to an environmental NGO. And so this phase simulates what happens when PES is removed. So the results, I'm going to go phase by phase, so I don't throw too much data at you at once. These red and blue lines that you can see are the average donation level per round. In this case, we're only seeing the first phase. So this is the average across 5 rounds where they played with the default rules. And you can see that for the most part, people were donating 40% of the money that they could have earned had they farmed it. So if you farm all of your tiles, the bar would go down to 0. But we see that for the most part, in the 6 groups, we had an average donation of about 40%, which means that they had relatively high levels of conservation. And it suggests that participants believe that protecting the forest was valuable from the beginning. So a lot of these people were incredibly poor. They were making less than 100 euros a month, and they were still willing to donate 40% of the money that we would have given them to conserve the forest. So this already shows that the 3 communities recognize that forests were valuable and were willing to put their money where their mouth was. They were willing to donate 40% of that money. In the PES phase, we see something which isn't surprising, which is conservation levels go up, because all of a sudden, before they were only donating out of goodwill, now we're actually incentivizing them to donate. So the conservation levels go up, but we see that the treatment that made conservation go up the highest was the blue one, which is the instrumental value. And so we think that this is probably because the instrumental treatment, where we were talking about ecosystem services being provided by nature, is much more closely aligned with the way that PES works. So the PES framework comes out of this ecosystem service model. And so perhaps highlighting the instrumental values of nature made it so that it was a lot more aligned with this type of program. However, this is what happens when we removed the PES. In the Afro-Colombian community, the levels went back to their original level of conservation. So we don't see motivational crowding in or out. We see that while you pay the community, they conserve more, and when you stop paying them, they go back to their original levels. But we see that in these two communities, we get motivational crowding in for one group, for one treatment, and here we see motivational crowding in for another treatment because the level is higher than it was in the first round. So let's first see, why don't we see motivational crowding out, despite the fact that in the literature it's been often associated with PES? Well, we think that first of all, it's because we frame the ecosystem service benefits as for farmers themselves rather than people downstream. So traditionally, PES is framed as, look, we're going to pay you because the people in the city, for example, need clean water in their rivers. And so if you're willing to carry out extra conservation at a personal cost, we're willing to compensate you for that. In our case, both of our treatments tried to get farmers to think about how valuable nature was personally for them, whether instrumentally or relationally. Secondly, we framed these PES, this hypothetical PES program in the game, in a way that didn't threaten the farmer's sense of autonomy, which is normally associated with motivational crowding out. So when an intervention makes you feel like people, the government, for instance, is removing freedom from you, it's a lot more likely for you to reject whatever they want you to do. So for instance, if I start getting fined for speeding on the highway, it's a lot more likely that if they remove the fines, I'll start speeding again because I felt like the government was trying to control what I wanted to do. In interventions that don't threaten people's sense of autonomy, motivational crowding out happens a lot less because people don't reject the goal of the program. And because PES are voluntary, and in our case, we let them decide, look, you have 6 hectares, and you can pick how many, if any, you want to conserve, and we're going to pay you. So we didn't remove their autonomy in any way. And so we think this helps for them not to reject conservation. But also, and I think this is very important, motivational crowding out is associated especially with situations where your main reason to carry out an activity is intrinsic. So you do it because you enjoy doing it. And we argue that most farmers weren't conserving forests because they enjoyed doing it or because they thought that it was the right thing to do. And this is evidenced by 2 things. First of all, 97% of the participants told us that they obtained some type of product from the forest. So the things that they could harvest directly from the forest were very closely tied with their livelihoods. And in this sense, we can see that already as an extrinsic motivation to conserve forest. So I don't want to conserve a forest because it's the right thing to do. I want to conserve a forest because otherwise I might not survive, because I need clean water, I need to heat my house with the wood from the forest, I need to feed my family by hunting or by gathering berries. And so because the initial motivation to conserve was already extrinsic, it was very hard to motivate, to crowd out the intrinsic motivation because it wasn't the primary drive that they had. Additionally, there's studies, for instance, this one by Bell from 2001, where they did interviews and they found that people that were more willing or most likely to say that nature was important for intrinsic reasons, so nature had a right to exist just independent of humans, the people that have that opinion tend to be people that live in urban areas and are highly educated. So it's almost like a privileged position that you take when you don't actually rely on nature for your day-to-day life. It's like, no, I want to protect it because I think it's right. Well, that's really easy to say when you don't need to go hunt for your next meal, in which case you might think that you want to protect nature because you need to survive and eat. And so again, this highlights that perhaps their main motivation to conserve initially, that 40% donation they were giving, wasn't based on intrinsic motivations, but it was based more on the fact that they recognize that they need nature to survive. We think that this is evidence that PES can still be framed in instrumental terms without necessarily imposing this mercantilistic rationality. So PES can be used without necessarily generating motivational crowding out. And now let's look at the motivational crowding in. Like I mentioned before, we see 2 groups that see motivational crowding in. The first one is the relational treatment for the indigenous community, where the difference between this level of conservation and this level of conservation after the payment has been removed, we consider that motivational crowding in, because now after the PES is done, they're still conserving more than before the PES was implemented. And with the campesino community, it happened with the instrumental treatment, where the blue line originally is behind the red one right there. But you can see that there's an increase in the level of conservation for this group. However, for the other 4 treatments, because we had 6 in total, the lines tend to go back to their original level. So the instrumental treatment in the indigenous community conservation went back to their original level. In the Afro-Colombian community, both treatments just went back to the original level. So why is this? Well, we think that for the indigenous community and the relational treatment, the framing of the PES was much more closely aligned with their human nature relational model that they had beforehand, and the type of their shared imaginary, the way that they talked about nature. This relational speech that the moderator gave was a lot more closely, it reflected a lot more closely the salient values that they had before, right? So the speech talked about concepts like in territory, we need to protect our territory, we need to protect nature because it's important for our buen vivir, which is a concept that's handled a lot in indigenous communities in Latin America. And it's this concept of living in harmony with nature. Like, we don't need to consume to be happier, we just need to be in harmony with each other, with nature. They refer to that as buen vivir. So we think that this treatment sort of tapped into pre-existent mental models that they had there. We also see that indigenous peoples are the only ethnic group in Colombia that lives primarily in rural areas. So both Afro-Colombians and the white population live mostly in cities, despite having rural inhabitants, but indigenous people live mostly in the countryside. And so we think that this facilitates a type of discourse and relationality with nature that is different from these other two groups. One final thing I'd like to say is that we actually see that the level of conservation in the relational treatment barely drops from the PES level. So this is the only group where we actually see, like, once you remove the payment, it managed to stay up just as high as when the payment was there, which again shows how much the relational discourse had an impact on the group, on the treatment. This doesn't mean, however, we don't mean to imply that relational values are not important for non-Indigenous people. What was a lot more likely is that the specific relational treatment we had was very closely aligned with the Indigenous worldview, and the other two treatments just didn't see themselves reflected in the socialization that we had. But again, relational values have been proven to be important for people all over the world, and here I included an example from the US, where they interviewed a group of bird watchers who are generally wealthy and slightly conservative in the US, in this particular group of bird watchers. And they initially asked them how important they thought it was for the government to take actions to stop climate change. And in general, they thought it wasn't very important. Then they went to another group of bird watchers and they told them, did you know that climate change is very likely to affect bird migration patterns? It can decrease the well-being of birds. And so suddenly they tapped into this thing that was really important for them, that they had a relationship with, which was birds, which was their hobby. And then they asked them, do you think it's important we take action against climate change? And all of a sudden the rates of how important they considered it spiked up. So this shows that relational values can be important for everyone, but you need to tap into the right relational value to get this type of response. We also see that the relational models that the Indigenous community scored higher on than the other two communities were devotion and ritualized exchange, which happen to be the two relational models that give nature agency, right? It almost personifies nature. Nature has a religious, sacred, or spiritual value to me, and ritualized exchange was, we have a debt toward nature for all that it gives us. And so again, these two relational models rely very heavily on relational values. So we think that's the fact that they scored highly on them, once again, reinforces that we saw motivational crowding in because the treatment reflected very closely the way they already relate to nature. For the campesino instrumental treatment, we see that this one was a lot more effective. So if we go back here, we can see that for this treatment, their conservation levels after the PES is removed remained considerably higher, almost 10 points higher than before the PES was ever introduced. And we think this is because it reflected, again, the way that they relate to nature. So when you talk about how important nature is as a source of wood, as a source of water, as a source of pollination, this is the type of discourse and imaginary that this community had beforehand. Looking at the relational models that they scored very highly in relative to the other two communities, this was detachment and domination. So both of these relational models put nature hierarchically underneath humans. And so it makes sense that framing nature as a provider of services, say, reflected the way that they already thought about nature to begin with, and therefore had a much higher impact in their behavioral change. And finally, which we think is quite important, this community, unlike the Indigenous and the Afro-Colombian community, was right on the highway. And so getting to the nearest urban center where the market was to sell their crops was like 15 minutes away. The campesino community was way up in the mountains, and you can see that in the photo on the top right. You had to take this dirt path for about an hour to get to the community, and only certain vehicles can go up that. So a normal car, we had to leave our car at the base, and we had this Jeep, which picked us up, fit 12 of us. We had two cars, and they asked all 12 of us to literally go inside the car if we could, and if not, to hang on to the outside of the car, because it was the only car that the community had to take people up and down. So the instrumental treatment, which asked people, imagine what you'd have to buy at the market if nature disappeared. Where would you get your wood? Where would you get your clean water? Where would you get your food? All of a sudden, for this community in particular, that had a much bigger impact. because if you take 2 hours, 1 hour down and 1 hour back to go to the market every time you need something that you normally just go right outside your house to pick up, some medicinal plants, then it activated these stewardship values a lot more. And we could see that those lasted in time because we saw motivational crowding in. However, we don't find any motivational crowding in or motivational crowding out for the Afro-Colombians. I don't have a reason for certain that this was the case, but I think that my main hypothesis is that neither of the two treatments was very well tailored to the Afro-Colombian community, unfortunately. One thing we found out after the fact is that this community is pushing really hard to become an ecotourism center. And so it's very likely if we'd framed the value of nature in those terms, like, hey, think about your future industry. Like if you want people to come here and stay the night and buy at your shops, we need to protect nature because it's going to be the source of this ecotourism. Well, it's possible that it would have had a bigger impact. So this is research for the future. And then probably another big factor that had an impact was the fact that this community was a lot more educated than the other two. So despite being adjacent to the indigenous community, we had half of the participants had gone to technical school or university, mostly technical school. And in general, very few of them had not completed primary school, only 13. This is very different from the other two communities where almost half of the campesinos and about a third of the indigenous community had not finished primary school. And so we think that in this sense, the Afro-Colombian participants were behaving more rationally. They were less likely to be affected by a relatively short treatment. So we were only talking about the value of nature for about 25 minutes. And so while we weren't paying them, they conserved their baseline level. We paid them and they conserved more, and then we stopped paying them and they just went back to their original level. And so the treatment didn't really have an impact on them. So the conclusions. Well, first of all, we find that PES with identical rules, because the experiments were always the same. The only thing that changed was this little speech and group discussion we had in the middle, but the PES rules were the same. We paid the same amount of money for the same amount of hectares. So PES with identical rules can have very different effects depending on how they're framed. So only depending on how you introduce the PES to the community, independently on what the actual rules of the PES are, can have a big impact. And the impact's going to be differentiated depending on the community's pre-existing motivations, their pre-existing ways of relating to nature. And this is because PES is imbued with new meanings and ways of interacting with nature that can interact with what was already there. So we can't think about PES as being implemented on a blank canvas. Instead, it's implementing on a series of socio-ecological models that have been there for hundreds of years, maybe. This means that there's no right way to frame the value of nature or PES, but instead, the PES practitioners need to strive to frame programs in a way that synergizes with locally salient values and worldviews. Thank you.
Bravo.
Let me know if any of you have any questions, or again, if you have any ways that you think I might be able to analyze this data. So
I have some questions.
Yes, well, please.
Well, I mean, I've learned a lot, so thank you very much. It was very nice, very clear explanation of everything, and something that I had no idea about all these studies, but I know that there are big part in BC3, and there's a big group there. So it's very nice to hear of all these science. And well, I have some methodological questions that are a little bit. I want to know a little bit more about this pyramid. It looks a little bit strange that you do this kind of scores. Why do you do this pyramid of scores? I mean, instead of doing something like from 1 to 10 or something like this. I mean, why do you want to emphasize the neutral thing? It looks like you want them to go to the neutral part, no, or something.
So this methodology is based on a pre-existing methodology called the Qed Method, just like the letter Q method.
Yeah.
And normally in that methodology, you offer anywhere from 40 to 80 statements, and you have a much bigger pyramid than the one I have.
All
And
right.
you ask people, and the statements are supposed to include every possible position on a given topic. So imagine we want to know how people feel about politicians in Spain. The statements could be like, I trust my politicians. I think politicians are all liars. I think politicians only want their own benefit. I think politicians want social benefit. And you give every possible position you can take on a topic,
All
and
right.
you ask people to organize them from very strongly disagree to very strongly agree. This
Yeah.
methodology is great because they call it a quanticological methodology because it's both qualitative and quantitative in the sense that it gives you a number of agreement for each parameter, but you can also rely on what people say, on their reasoning. So normally you want a single moderator sitting next to the person, and the person has to be narrating why they're organizing the card in one order or another order. In our
Mhm.
case, this methodology takes like 3 hours to do, and it was impossible to do this and the experiment. So we tried to reduce it into
Yeah.
just 7 statements instead of 70 statements.
Yeah.
But our idea was to try and stick to this previously established methodology, which was the Qed method.
All right. All right. So yeah, one more thing. I mean, well, I didn't necessarily start with the university people because I'm not. So all the participants were university
No,
students.
no, no, no. We
I
did
didn't
a
understand.
we did a pilot in a university just to
All
try out
right.
the methodology and see the
All
logistics.
right. Okay. Okay. Okay.
But then all the participants belong to the indigenous community, the Afro-Colombian community
All
over
right.
there.
All right. I didn't understand that. I was a little bit confused. My last comment is that of course your big result of all this is that the indigenous communities were sensitive to the narrative, of the relational
Values.
the relational values, no, and
Hmm.
of course they are, as a reviewer or as a critical person, I would think how tailored as was the narrative towards the indigenous relational values, because
Yeah,
perhaps you yourself just say that the Afro-American,
Colombian.
Afro-Colombian community, they were less sensitive to the narrative because probably it was not tailored for them. But
Hmm.
perhaps it was more tailored for the indigenous, like bringing all these things of religion or something like this, or not.
So I think we touched upon, so the whole speech lasted like 6 or 7 minutes. So we touched upon different things. But for instance, one of the anecdotes that we gave, we were talking about how important it was that Colombia was very biodiverse and how important the different animals were for different people. And for instance, we mentioned a legend about the condor being the one in Colombia. There's this legend about the condor being the animal that brings the sun up. And that, of course, is an indigenous legend. We talked
Mhm.
about how important it was to protect the territory, which includes nature. And the concept of territory is very closely tied with indigenous narratives. So
Yeah.
Afro-Colombian communities talk about territory as well, but the focus is a lot more about the people in the territory having sovereignty. Whereas the indigenous concept of territory is a lot more closely tied with the land and how the land has shaped the people. And unfortunately, so Afro-Colombians were brought over from Africa, so their connection to the land is different than that of the indigenous people that see themselves as the people that have been there for thousands of years tied to this specific land.
Yeah, yeah. No, I was wondering that perhaps the campesinos, they are, perhaps they even are a little bit reluctant to all these indigenous narratives or something. I don't know. I don't know. I wonder if you know something, or you have some idea there why they didn't, because they also live in the same environment at the end of the day. No, they are
Yeah.
also somehow. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, they were 20 kilometers away. So I mean, I'm not an ecologist. So for me, everything that was big and green was just jungle. So I don't know if the height was different. Maybe it was a cloud forest versus a
yeah,
temperate forest. It looked
yeah,
very similar to me. And they were quite close to each other. But I don't think, I didn't get any sense being there that they had this like rejection or like no one like put their nose up at this type of like speech. It just seemed like it didn't have any effect. Like it didn't changed because their conservation level went back to what it was originally. For me, it didn't have a negative effect. It just had no effect at all.
perfect. But what would be interesting as a follow-up of your studies is to get to these things that make them sensitive. No, I mean, because you got sensitive the indigenous community because probably the narrative is easier to find it. But how can you make these people sensitive? No, I mean, this is
and I mean, as my own personal bias, I had worked with 2 indigenous communities before. So these were ethnically, they were a different indigenous group, but a lot of the narratives that are shared in Colombia, especially when they're tied to politics and land, are quite similar across different indigenous groups.
Yeah.
And I was a lot more familiar with that. And so it's very possible that that bias shows itself in the text. I'd never worked with Afro-Colombians before. And so like you say, it would be interesting, for instance, to do the same experiment, but rather than using instrumental versus relational values, using 3 different relational value one tailored to each community. That could be it.
Something like that. I mean, like, well, I mean, of course, you can't do everything. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
The nice thing about these results, I think, is that it shows that PES in Colombia right now it was legislated in 2017, so it's quite new. And it shows that you can have the same rules for the PES as long as then you have a decentralized implementation. So with the same type of payment structure, everything, just let the local environmental agencies be the ones that take PES to the people, because they're going to be a lot more familiar with the type of discourse that people have regarding rather than having a very top-down implementation of PES.
Right. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. Does anyone else have any questions or comments, suggestions, criticisms? No? Okay, well, in that case, thank you everyone for coming. And next week, I'm going to send an email out soon. Ambika is going to have on Thursday her mock PhD defense. So it would be great if you can show up, support her, and give her any pointers that she can use for her real PhD defense, which is later on. So,
all right.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Bosco.
Thank you, Bosco.
So what's your cat, please?
Yes, sure.